Okay, isolation in Whistle, and I'll come to you. This is a student's response. Got band 4, 22 marks out of 30. And let's just have a little read through. We're going to highlight isolation and answering the question in yellow. So that's the AO1. We're going to highlight method in green. That's AO2. Okay, and let's see if we can deconstruct this essay and try to identify where in the text the student is writing about. So, and notice that the student has written the writer and not written Susan Hill, and that's what you must do in your exam. Don't write the surname of the author, because it's just going to could be a disaster, basically, particularly if they've got a long name. So the writer develops feelings of isolation in the passage. Okay, so answering the question AO1, to feel, describing the house to feel like a ship at sea. The simile, okay, so the writer uses the simile, which directly implies the narrative voice feels alone, as sea connotes to barren landscapes and suggests a lack of connection to civilization, which highlights how isolated the house is. So that's a nice explanation and interpretation of the simile, like a ship at sea. Now, moving on. Inside the house, there was the sound of moaning coming from the chimneys that were whistling through every nook and cranny. Here, the author personifies. So, AO2. So they moved on to their next quotation, moving on down the text. Here, the author personifies the sound of the house and likens them to human noises. This use of sensory adjectives could not only imply the sheer strength and volume of the wind passing through the house, but also perhaps the utter lack of human company, and therefore the isolation that the narrative voice feels. So sorry, nice link back to isolation. The fact that the wind is whistling through the chimneys is, again, giving us this sense of nature kind of encompassing the narrator and making the narrator feel insignificant and more by themselves. That's a nice little link back to the question. So notice how much AO2 there is. Look at how much green there is. There's lots of in-depth analysis of the quotation. Okay, so moving on further down the text. Furthermore, he describes how the house bore one winter of gales and driving rain and sleet and spray. Okay. Now, the use of the synthetic list. So here we go. So that's green. It's all the use of the synthetic list. The and is evocative of the way year after year of harsh weather has crashed against the house and represents the build-up of winter after winter. This bold description is immediately contrasted to the narrative voice's memory of his childhood, where he was in the snug safety of his bed, listening to the wind rage like a lion howling at the doors, okay, when he was a child. But you feel that safety in your bed when you're a child, don't you? You don't feel that anxiety like anything's going to get you. You feel that warm, snuggly, comforting feeling. So look at this AO2. It's fabulously descriptive. We've got the synthetic list of and, and that creates an overwhelming effect. And then they're contrasted, the effect of this moment, the and of the wind, the and of the wind, the and of the wind, and that overwhelming sense of the power of nature, to that rather kind of more positive memory of a child as not feeling so threatened by nature. So this is an example of structure, a structural contrast that the writer is using. So that's very good use of analysis there of methods. Okay, asyndetic lists and the contrast. So looking at structure. The author employs this simile and personifies the wind to show the strength and power of the wind, much like the narrative voice's reality. However, the difference is that in his memory, the wind could not reach him, because when he was a child, the wind could not reach him, and we get a sense that the narrative voice is longing to feel safe once again. That's a really nice interpretation. This contrasts to his reality, and so we can sense that he longs for the past where he felt safe, and he understands the reality that he is totally alone, thus linking to isolation. So they're zooming out here. They're zooming out as to why the writer uses a simile and the power of the wind and the personification of the wind, and looks at how the narrator felt safe when he was a child but currently doesn't, and therefore has the students interpreted that they want to feel safe again. The narrator wants to feel safe again. So it's a really nice analysis there, and linking back to the isolation there at the end. Okay. Moreover, the author uses short sentence structures. So if you haven't explicitly looked at structure in your own response, you must do. So one of your examples, you must analyse for structure, okay? And this is what this student has clearly done. Moreover, the author uses short sentence structures and rhetorical questions to mimic the narrative voice's thought process. So let's highlight that in green, because they're going straight in. You don't mess around, you go straight into the analysis. The isolated sentences of "there was no child, I knew that," and internal questions, "how could there be?" depict how utterly alone he is in his questions that remain unanswered. Okay, so alone linking to isolation. So we've got the short sentence structures, the rhetorical questions, short sentence answers, abrupt, uncertain, quite severe, disjointed, short sentences, confusion, and then the rhetorical questions, no one's answering them, creating that sense that he is by himself, and therefore linking it nicely to isolation. Okay, the writer employs these references to his thoughts to show his feelings of isolation, as he has no one else to question. Right, so no one's answering his questions, he's on his own. Alright, so nice link back to isolation. Then the narrative voice describes how the lights went out. So moving on down the text now towards his last or his penultimate point, how the lights went out. Okay, so we've got, and he stood there in the pitch blackness. So we've got a sense of colour here, of imagery. This complete darkness has connotations of fear. So we're looking at the method of connotations of darkness, semantics of darkness, and the lack of light. And this gives us the sense that the narrator is vulnerable and exposed, which creates tension in the passage. Without this light, he is totally dependent. He's totally dependable and totally alone. And so we can see his feelings of isolation. So without the light, okay, we're linking to isolation. All right, so we've got, let's look at the method here. We've got connotations. We've got, you could even look at imagery. You could look at colours. Okay, lack of light. That's the method. The writer's using, colours and using connotations of dark colours and imagery to give us the sense of darkness that the narrator feels, which again we can link to isolation. Okay, we can't see, and therefore he's isolated. And then the final point, let's see what the student writes about. So finally he describes how terrible cry of the child borne on the gust towards me. And here the writer creates imagery that any connection to civilization is extremely distant. And so he is left alone in the dark with this repeating cry that represents his feelings of total isolation. Okay, so the cry that is borne on the gust towards me is a nice, lovely little quotation. It does create imagery, but more specifically, it's speaking metaphorically. Okay, a cry can't actually be carried on the gusts, on the wind. So it's speaking in this really nice metaphorical way. And again, you know, I think maybe to get higher marks, the student potentially could have drilled down on some words and interpreted their meaning and looked at how they sort of added value to the technique that was being explored. So it's slightly more in-depth analysis. So the connections towards civilization, distant, feeling of isolation. So AO2, and then a link back to isolation. So what can we take from this student's response? We can take that we've learned skills that are very, 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 very similar. We know that we need to pick out examples of AO1 that answer the question within the text. We know then that we need to analyse those examples for AO2 in detail, okay, because AO2 gets more marks than AO1 does. So you need to really make sure that you're doing your analysis. You're saying 2 or 3 clever things about an example that you've got that answers the question, okay, and that you're linking back. Look how the student links back very, very, very concisely to isolation at the end of his paragraph. So I hope this has been helpful to you. I've emailed you a copy of this, and it actually gives you the examiner's feedback. So whatever text you get tomorrow in poetry and prose, make sure you read the question carefully, that you read the text, you highlight those moments in chronological order that answer the question, and then you build your paragraph around those examples, okay? Analysing each of those examples in detail for their AO2, all right? Hopefully this is helpful. Okay.